Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Today is Election Day in Canada. So, two things. Number one, we are going to not talk politics today, at least not Canadian politics. We're going to talk about international relations, and we've got a defense expert from the Kyiv Post with us tonight, and we're going to chat with him about what's going on in Ukraine with the war. And we're going to have an election special tonight starting at 9 o'clock. We're going to have numerous different guests from 9 until the results get in, probably around 10:30, 10:45, with great conversations about the election and what it all means for Canada, for international relations, for the economy, for our trade relationships with the United States, etc. If you don't know, if you're just tuning in, the Brian Crombie Radio Hour is on every night at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream it online at www.saga960am.ca. My podcast and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, and on social media and on podcast services on YouTube as soon as the radio show goes to air. What we do is we interview business people, economics oriented people, politicians, international relations, defense experts, and lifestyle people. We're a really curious long form interview where we try to get to really understand our guest, what's going on, and unpack whatever the issues are. And so tonight we've got a really incredible guest who I've been following a little bit, and his posting of what's going on in Ukraine at the front line is fascinating. Stefan Korshak is with us tonight. He's the defense correspondent at the Kyiv Post. Stefan, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
And are you coming to us right now from Kyiv?
I am indeed.
And how was last night?
Last night was relatively quiet. Kyiv is big and Ukraine is big, so if there are strikes, it is not necessarily the case that you'll hear it in your part of the city, especially if it's drones. And that's basically what it was last night.
So you post, several times a day on what's going on at the front lines, what you think is going on in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Tell us where you think the war is today.
Well, by and large, I'd say it's at a stalemate, and it's an attrition war. And you can debate as to whether the attrition is more in Ukraine's advantage or Russia's advantage. The Ukrainians are more effective. The Russians have more force and firepower, I guess it would be safe to say. Neither side is looking like it's about to collapse. So it looks like it's going to go on for a while.
Go on for a while, like forever?
No war ever goes on forever. It's really more a matter of which side. It's either most likely scenario is that which side is going to crack first, which side is going to get sick of it first. And there's always the possibility that one of the sides will make an advance militarily, some kind of new technology that would give them a big advantage on the battlefield and break the more or less stable military situation. There's a small chance of that. Then the main chance is if there's going to be a hard solution, is going to be one of the sides cracking. There is a chance of a ceasefire being implemented and maybe even a peace. But there are problems with that too. So the short term doesn't look like substantial change in the short term. That would be my prediction.
So, what we get is a sense of nightly raids on Kyiv or on different cities within Ukraine, that some of them have been attacking civilian facilities that should have been known as civilian facilities. We hear stories here in Canada about drones and how effective they've become, and that they're almost running the front lines of the war from a reconnaissance standpoint and from an attack standpoint. Give us a sense of what's actually going on, if you could.
Well, there are two sides to that. I'll take the second part first, which is the battle side of it, the frontline side. And there it is safe to say that war has changed. The way that wars are fought has changed in a very, very dramatic way. I often say it's similar to the introduction, for instance, of a rifled musket. But it's probably not as significant as, let's say, the introduction of the horse to warfare, if you like to go back into history. These days, statistically, both sides 2 out of every 3 casualties is caused by a drone. Something like 70% of all destroyed equipment caused by a drone. That is head over heels different from the way wars used to be even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. The thing that's driving it is that drones are, and this is really the Ukrainians very clearly have a lead, and they seem to be moving ahead in this, is that the drones essentially are cheap. You can make one for about $500. It can go about 20 kilometers, and it can carry an explosive that will take out a tank. And it's not difficult to train people to operate these drones. I mean, it takes skill, but it's not like you have to train a pilot for a fighter jet for a year and then have him practice for another year and a half before he's capable of fighting. And so the Ukrainians especially are able to operate these small drones in mass, and they place observation drones above the battlefield. And so if something moves out into the open, it gets spotted and it gets attacked. It's not too different in a lot of ways from these apocalypse, end of the world, uh, Terminator kind of movies that you've seen where there's all these machines out there hunting people. I haven't really been heavily underneath a drone presence, but I felt it, and it's scary, and it's everywhere, and it affects everything that you do. And the upshot of that is that neither side has a solution to it. Since the Russians are still trying to attack, they're the ones that are bearing the brunt of all the attacks of all these drones, and it's very bloody. Um,
How do
on
you
the
how can you defend yourself? Can you like what do you
Yeah,
do? You
sure. There
try to
are
shoot them
ways to
down?
defend this. Yes, sure. I mean, if you have really good nerves and a shotgun, and you can knock one of these things down. It's a drone. It's a little plastic drone, so it's not hard to destroy. But of course, the operator of the drone knows that somebody might shoot at it. He's not going to just approach by the easiest and most simple route. Almost always a person under attack, an attack by a drone, he's not like standing there shoulder to shoulder with 4 other guys with shotguns. He's running and trying to hide because he wants to live. And the safest path is to find cover where the drone can't get at you. There are jammers. You'll have supply corridors, roads where the soldiers will put up nets, very like fishing nets, covering an entire road, sides and basically a ceiling above the road, so the drones can't get through. Um, all of these are, they have some effect, but none of it is really a permanent effect. You may have seen, or your listeners may have seen pictures of, let's say, tanks that have all manner of defenses hung on them, log walls and wire netting and chain link fencing. And those are probably, along with the tank's armor, proof against the drone. But the problem is that the drone operators, they're not robots. They're human beings, and they look for the weakest point. So if the target is a tank, both sides do this, they don't bother right off the bat attacking the thickest army or where the drone armor is. They'll just attack the tank's track. Or they'll put a mine in front of it. Once the tank stops, then they just hit it over and over again until it catches on fire. Or they're good enough. If there's a hatch open, they'll fly a drone carrying an explosive down the hatch once it's stopped. So, yeah, sure, there's ways to deal with the drones, but they are so common and so cheap and so precise because you've got effectively, think of it as a very big hand grenade or a mortar round that's being flown by a human being who's got a screen, and he is capable of flying that drone wherever he feels like he needs to. That's a very, very difficult technology to deal with on a big scale. So they dominate. Now,
How far away are these drone operators, and can you attack the drone operators?
if you can find them, certainly, but they don't want that. They are typically between 20 and 50 kilometers away, depending on the type of drone. And they're not out in the open. It's not like they're flying a flag or sticking antennas in the air, trying to make it easy to find. And this is a huge territory you're talking about. So, I mean, if you let's say take a city the size of Toronto, maybe 5 drone teams might be able to keep drones in the air that would probably be able to spot most. City's a bad example, but just think of a territory of that space. But you 5 or 6 drone teams probably could detect, if it was just open fields, things moving in a territory that size. So think about trying to find 5 or 6 guys with minivans in a territory, a farming territory the size of Toronto. It's not easy. They hide. So yeah, you can look for them. Sometimes they get found, and if they get found, they get attacked. But it's a question of density because you've got like 10, 20 guys, and they're covering a territory, maybe 20 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep. So it's difficult to
Now
deal
you
with.
say these drones are cheap. We've heard stories of $500,000 drones the Americans have in
Yeah.
Yemen being shot down. We hear about drones from Iran that are pretty
Well, it's like
technologically
it's
advanced.
like yeah. But
Give us a sense of what, like,
well,
you say
it's
cheap,
like
but how cheap is cheap?
it's
$500,
like
really?
cars. I mean, it's like our cars. How much does a car cost? Well, the answer is, well, what kind of car are you talking about? What I've just been talking about is the cheap drone, what they normally hear called the FPV drone, first person view drone. And it's a little quadcopter capable of carrying, let's say, a charge of maybe maximum 5 kilos, usually 3. And that little sucker costs about $500 if it's assembled just out of parts by people in their garage. If you have mass production, which the Ukrainians do, it's cheaper, $500. By a way of comparison, a precision guided Hellfire missile manufactured, let's say, by the Americans. Oh, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but it's orders of magnitude more. It's like $70,000 or something along those lines, maybe even $100,000. So dealing with and the explosive that the drone delivers is effectively the same as the explosives that the very expensive precision guided high-end NATO standard missile. And that's at the bottom end. You then you can go up to drones that cost multiples of millions of dollars, and they get more expensive depending on how many bells and whistles and what kind of capacity is built into them. For instance, there is a drone, both sides operate it, which is it's a loitering drone that goes about 50 kilometers. It has a warhead slightly larger than the little cheap drone, but it can go out 50 kilometers and then circle. And if a target is detected, it can be directed to the target. And some of the more advanced versions of them, as I understand it, have a primitive version of AI, meaning that once they get their sensors get fixed on a target like a tank, they can home in on the tank even without the operator guiding it, meaning that they are more resistant to jamming. Those things cost more. Typically, I would sort of in the 10 to 50,000 range. Once you talk about a drone that is able to go out 100 to 150 kilometers, and it has optics, thermal cameras and whatever else you might want to put on it. Even they have radar interceptors, as I understand it. Those things can cost more. The numbers vary depending on what the sourcing is. Both sides are building their own. So if you're talking about comparing them to the prices that the Ukrainians and the Russians too are dealing with as compared to the Americans, well, here they are contracting for a war that is in progress where the munitions are being expended. And the moment it gets expended, there's going to be a need for another one. And that really drives the price down. American weaponry, by and large, isn't contracted for and bought that way. It's bought once and it's expected to basically be in inventory permanently. So the prices are much, much higher. So when the Ukrainians, they say, I haven't actually checked their numbers personally, but they say that they could, if they chose, build a drone analogous to an American Reaper drone for about 1/5 of the price, maybe even less than that, with the same capacities both for observation and hitting targets. They do not choose to build that particular drone because, from their perspective, it's too dangerous. There's too many anti-drone systems out there. Because at a certain point, a drone gets big enough so that it's really not a little bitty drone that can't be attacked by standard anti-aircraft weapons. It's an aircraft, and it can be detected and attacked by anti-aircraft weapons. And both sides have pretty much saturated the airspace with coverage from those weapons. So an American Reaper drone in this environment here would the expectation would be it would get shot down immediately.
And Ukraine is mass producing these cheaper drones in
Absolutely.
Ukraine?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. I've seen it. It's not a secret. There's plenty of open sources. People build them in their garages. They have like, civilian volunteer groups that get together. There is serial production. There are, underground factories, which is really more an underground assembly plant. It's really not so much a conveyor as it is just technicians sitting and assembling things like, if you could imagine the way that smartphones get assembled. It's sort of that kind of environment, but underground and massively. And the Ukrainians last year, their figures, they say that they made about 1.5 million drones, of which about 1.4 million were these little bitty ones. And this year, they say that that number is going to go up to 4 million. I don't think that anybody has the ability to check those numbers exactly, but you really don't see people here contradicting it. The feeling is that there are lots of drones and the production is really going through the roof.
War really has changed. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with our expert about what's going on in the war in Ukraine. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We got Stefan Korshak with us today. He is the defense coordinator consultant for the Kyiv Post. Stefan, tell me a little bit about you. How did you become this expert on military affairs for the Kyiv Post?
Well, experts putting it pretty strongly. I became the defense correspondent for Kyiv Post because I'm a long-term reporter. That's my profession. I've been working in the former Soviet Union for almost a quarter century in one job or another. I have more experience in wire service reporting than anything else, but I've also done newspapers and television and even radio at one point. And I'm former military, but that was a long time ago when I was a young man. And, over the years, I've wound up covering a bit of the Chechnya War, the Georgia War, the Donbass conflict. And during the Donbass conflict, I took a break from journalism and I worked for an international monitoring group called the OSCE, and they were trying to determine how the ceasefire was going. Long story short, it wasn't really, but that put me and people that I was working with, obviously, on the front lines. And also, I did some time in Afghanistan. But that being said, I'm not a combat correspondent who's constantly on the front lines and dodging bullets. That's like a young man's job. I'm a Kiev correspondent. Sometimes I go close to the front lines, but by and large, I watch the media, I talk to people, I try and get a picture of what's going on. That's sort of my professional background. I'm an American from Texas, love Canada, think you guys are great. And that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
And do you live in Kyiv?
Yeah, I've been based in Kiev for quite a long time.
So you've been here in Kyiv through the whole war?
Yes, sure.
And your building attacked, your livelihood impacted, or how have you survived?
Our building, thank God, did not get hit. But at the start of the war, certainly there was a cruise missile strike. There were a couple of them actually. Let's say in a half kilometer from where I'm sitting right now. On Thursday evening, there was yet another Russian attack. There were no hits where I was, but I went out on my balcony and I could watch the anti-aircraft missiles going up from like a park near from where I am, like hundreds of other Kiev residents. It's not like I'm unique that way, but certainly you get to see it. It's hard to miss. One time a Russian missile hit right next to where our daughter was going to dance lessons, except that there was a day off, so she wasn't going there. But I mean, the blast took out a hotel that was right next to it and ruined the front entrance. So, as a parent, you go, well, glad that it didn't happen while our daughter was there. So yeah. I mean, you can't miss it. But
so life has gone on.
Certainly. Yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah,
I
it's
think I
that
think many people find it shocking and surprising that life can, like your daughter can still go to dance lessons in the middle of a war.
I mean, to be fair, at a certain point we concluded that it wasn't really it wasn't possible to get a stable life and a normal education under wartime circumstances. So my wife and daughter are outside of Ukraine in a stable European country. But that's primarily because our daughter's a good student. We want her to have a good education, and it's all very often remote here these days. But in terms of people dealing with the war and life going on, there is really no alternative action or reaction to it. And anybody, I think, would, by and large, great majority of people, they'll react the same as the Ukrainians. I mean, we have all watched the World War II movies where, the British and the Londoners and their stiff upper lip underneath the German bombardment. And you go, well, God, how did they ever hold up under that? And then you look at the people in Kiev, and they're your neighbors, they're people, I don't know who parent teacher organizations you meet with or you work with them, and they're just responding like absolutely normal people. And you have a threat that's unpleasant, but you've got stuff to do, so you do it.
How does an American from Texas end up in Ukraine? Given your last name, are you from? Is your background Ukrainian?
That's a very reasonable guess, and actually, my background on my father's side is from the Ukrainian area. Although it's not just Ukrainian, there's Russians and Jews, Moldovans, and people like that also on my father's side of the family. But my mother's side of the family is totally not. It's British Isles, mostly Scots. And I wound up here because, I like languages, I guess. And anyway, when I went finished, I did graduate school, and I came out of graduate school Ivy League with a Russian Eastern European Studies degree. And that led to work in the former Soviet Union, which led fairly quickly to journalism. And once I was in journalism, I worked in a lot of places in the former Soviet Union, and I found that I liked Ukraine the best. I mean, I speak the languages, so it's helpful there. But of pretty much of all the countries that I've been in the former Soviet Union, the treatment that I get, the way that the people relate to me is more just sort of like normal, not weird in any way in Ukraine. I get treated well in a lot of places, but the Ukrainians, they're very cool with foreigners. They don't really have any weird expectations of it. They don't particularly shun outsiders, and I mean, it's not exactly like they're like super multicultural, but nobody really is dominant in Ukraine. No one ethnicity, no one language. So probably that makes it easier for a guy like me. So anyway, I've
I
worked here for a long
spent
time.
I spent a fair amount of time in Kyiv in 2006 to 2008, and it was a beautiful city. Gorgeous onion dome churches and a vibrant downtown and great restaurant life. What's it like today?
It's better now. Ha ha ha.
Really?
I know that. Yeah, I know that that sounds weird, but I mean, we're talking about almost 20 years of development, competition in the restaurant industry, improved streets. The traffic is worse. Absolutely. I mean, I was here in that time. But the public transportation is more developed. There are more shops. It's become it's incredibly digitalized, so I can order pretty much anything I want on my phone. Things are cheap, so some of the cheapest and fastest internet, as I understand it, on the European continent is here. I was surprised when I found that out. So it's a very competitive economy. There's lots of small businesses. uh, the corruption that was present in the mid 2000s, I would say, well, it's absolutely still here. Any Ukrainian will tell you that, but it's less. It's their rule of law is progressing.
So
So if you
when I was there in 2006 to 2008, we were warned that that the fire chief would be looking for money, that the police chief would be looking for money, that the health inspector would be looking for money, and the corruption was rampant. And we didn't make the investment because of some of our concerns about we just didn't know what the costs would be. And we hear certainly, from some people in the United States comments constantly about that it's still a very corrupt society. What's your sense?
Not as much. And I think that for small business, it's pretty rare. And I get the impression that in those industries where corruption really, the corrupt people can't make a huge amount of money, it pretty much is weeded out. I wouldn't say completely, but an example I like to give is that at one point my wife decided to run a dress shop, a seamstressing shop, and the business was not overly successful. But she went through it, start to founding the business, finding a space, getting the approval from the fire inspector, all of that. And she did that for about 3 years, and nobody ever came to her with their hand out. Now, it wasn't a particularly wealthy business, but that's a real example from small business. I hear and I believe that in those industries where one, not just in Ukraine would expect at least some degree of corruption. For instance, construction permits for buildings and where property values are high. That's a place where it's expected. It's not considered outrageous, but just as I might not expect to get a building permit, let's say in New York City, without, if not greasing palms, then at least the friendly support of an official here or there. Absolutely, that's got to be still the case here in Ukraine. And really, the more that the industry is monopolized and under the control of either a businessman or a certain section of the government, I, as a journalist, would expect corruption to be more possible there. But small business, even medium-sized business, I know of operations that basically they just work. McDonald's has been here forever, and I from time to time bump into their executives and I go, okay, so how many bribes are you paying? They keep saying we've never paid a bribe and we don't intend to. And McDonald's is growing here. So, I mean, maybe they're not telling me the truth. I kind of think that they are, but, mixed bag would be my answer to you on that.
Fascinating. That's really interesting. You mentioned that your wife and daughter have gone outside of Ukraine. Have many families gone outside of Ukraine?
Sure, it's huge, and it's partially a brain drain, and it's partially just a demographic. It's a real demographic punch. And I wish I had the numbers at my fingertips. If I remember correctly, about 1/10. Somebody listening will know this better than me, but just offhand, something like 1/10 of Ukraine's entire population is probably out of the country, or at least probably left the country. So if we say that Ukraine had a population of, let's say, 40 million people at the start of the war, that means that 4 million people left the country. Some of them have come back, but that's just, one out of every 10 Canadians. Think about it. It's a giant number. What's more, it's not an exact demographic representation of the country nationwide. That is, there's a law in place that men effectively of military age aren't allowed to lead the country. There are very rare exceptions, but in general, that's the rule, which means that those that left are by and large women and children. There are also, for instance, one example, if you're the head of the family of more than 3 children, then they'll let you go out. But that means that there's this huge dearth of basically women who have children in the country. Now, of course, you still do see children, you still do see mothers pushing, prams, that's still absolutely the case, but it's different than before. And you also don't see many military-age men on the streets because partially a lot of them are in the military. The military is just giant. I mean, there's like 1 million people, one way or another, they say, are involved or are employed by the military. And the Ukrainians are facing problems filling out their ranks. And so at the start of the war, there was just massive amounts of people volunteering to fight. Well, that's stopped. And so now there's a draft still in place, and the Ukrainians need people to fight, and they don't have enough volunteers. So if you are a military-age man who fits the window of potential draftee. I mean, it's not exactly like you'll get pulled off the streets, but if you don't have, you can get stopped by the police. And if they find out, they just did a random stop, and if they find out that you're a draft dodger, you'll get sent into the military pretty quickly, which of course is not something that usually a person walking on the street wants to have happen. So it's not a normal demographic situation in the country. Small villages are just empty lots of times. But then you go to a place where wealth is more concentrated and where war work is being done. I, for instance, am in Kyiv, and it looks vibrant. It's kind of a wartime vibrance, and it's not comparable to, it's not really representational of the entire country. You know, we can go to, let's say, a place like Kharkiv, or a better example even would be Odessa down on the Black Sea, which is just a gorgeous city, you know, a cute, Asian culture, all sorts of tradition, rich background, and they get hit very regularly by the Russian. The Russians use kamikaze drones there, and the Russians seem to prefer to target the power grid. And so you have this sort of wonderful seaside city that's got this great seafaring tradition, this great Jewish imprint, and lots of times the power is off there because of the Russians and the Russian attacks. So, and it's like not nice there because of that in that sense. So, you know, you can't really say that it's like great, but it's not. You get the impression, I think, from the Western media that everybody in Ukraine is like hunkering down in their basements and fearful of the next Russian attack. And it's not like that. That's people sort of go on with their lives, do their thing, and then when the Russian attacks come in, people take whatever steps they choose to take. Some people go to the basement, some people just blow it off and continue sleeping or whatever. The attack comes, it goes, and then life goes on.
Incredible. Really thank you for staying there and reporting on what's going on. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back, and we're going to go through sort of some of the other issues that and other areas in Ukraine that are currently in the news, and get Stefan's sense of what's going on. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to take a break and come back to a more military conversation, though this has been really fascinating. Stefan, understanding a little bit about you and life in Ukraine. Thank you for that. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Wire. We're chatting tonight with Stefan Korshak, who is the defense correspondent for the Kyiv Post. We've had an interesting conversation just before the break with him about life in Ukraine and what he's doing and what his family's doing and what other people are doing. Now, Stefan, let's go back and talk about some of the different facets of the front lines, if we could. There was that area in Russia that Ukraine attacked, Kursk, I think it was called. Has it been primarily recaptured by Russia?
Yes, the Russians took about, well, what is it now? I guess about 9 months, maybe 8 or 9 months to force the Russians out. Force the Ukrainians out. They, in the process of doing that, deployed about 10,000, they say, North Korean soldiers. It was a lot of it very bitter fighting. Casualties were particularly high, we understand, on the Russian side, but the Ukrainians also were bloodied. And slowly the Russians pushed the Ukrainians out. The Russians announced, yesterday, that they had finally pushed the Ukrainians out of Kursk Oblast, they call it. There are two asterisks that probably need to be attended to that. Number one, if you're really, really picky, there are still some Ukrainian positions. You can see them in the satellite photos that are still in Kursk Oblast by the border, but big picture, the Ukrainians are pushed out of Kursk Oblast. You can't contradict that.
What do you think about the whole strategy? Was it smart for Ukraine? Was it just a distraction that was meant to take Russian forces away from other areas? Like, what do you sense?
It was. The Ukrainian approach towards the Russians pretty much since the start of 2023, based on the fact that the Russians have so much more force, and really critically, the Russians are far more willing to just take casualties. They're more capable of it. They, don't have an authoritarian country. They can force people to take casualties. They don't have to justify it. Is that the Ukrainians will attack strategically, but try and defend tactically. So for the Ukrainians, the strategy is inflict casualties on the Russians and try and create situations where the Russians feel obliged to attack. The logic, therefore, behind the invasion of Russia in Kursk was to politically to embarrass Putin and to demonstrate to Ukraine's potential allies and real allies that Ukraine is capable of taking action. But more importantly, from just the attritional point of view, it created a situation where the Russians really had no option. They had to come straight at the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians were geared to deal with those attacks. And over time, the Russians paid a pretty high price to return their territory to their control. The Ukrainians argue that that was worth it for two reasons. Number one, just accumulated Russian casualties. And number two, having done that, having effectively triggered major battles inside of Russia. Those are battles that are not taking place inside of Ukraine. Those are not Ukrainian houses and schools and streets being destroyed by fighting. It's Russian houses and schools and streets being destroyed by fighting. So the Ukrainian argument is that if there must be attritional fighting, better for it to be in Russia than it to be in Ukraine. There is some sense to that. The question that you have to ask is, was it worth it for the Ukrainians to pay the price in casualties that they did, because it didn't come for free? And that's a hard question to answer without really hard information about troops available for both sides. I get the impression that it was a worthwhile move by the Ukrainians, that it made sense and it did pan out. Certainly, there were signs that the Russians were forced to draw units that they were planning to attack Ukraine with at a different location, and were forced to deploy them to Kursk, so that certainly had some effect. But whether or not, very great picture, it worked out for the Ukrainians on the attritional side, really there's not enough data to say. There is, however, another aspect to this, and this isn't really that well reported yet, but effectively the moment that the Ukrainians left in large part from Russia in the Kursk region, they invaded in the Belgorod region. So it's like one oblast westward. And there are Ukrainians still invading Russian right now. It's a smaller enclave, but they're dug in, and it's the same routine repeated. That is, the Ukrainians are in a defensive position. They are hoping that the Russians will attack. The Russians, of course, are doing what they can to make it easier for themselves. So they're dropping bombs. They're firing weapons from long range prior to making the ground attack. But it's not as if the Russians have forced the Ukrainians out of Kursk Oblast, and it's just that, and that's the end of Ukrainian incursions into Russia. There is a Ukrainian incursion in Russia ongoing right now, and
Really, I didn't know that.
yeah,
We're
well,
also hearing.
yeah,
Sorry, we're
yeah.
also hearing about, I guess more Ukrainian attacks of infrastructure, energy, et cetera, within Russia. And that the Americans don't allow the use of certain weapons when it's on Russian soil. Tell me, where are we on in that stage of the
No, that's
of the war?
a terrific topic. The the Americans themselves are not making clear, and I'm talking about the Biden administration, about what they were really allowing the Ukrainians to do and not to do with long-range weapons provided to the Ukrainians. Um, at the time, they were saying, we're not, we don't really put any brakes on the Ukrainians unless we think that there's a real risk that it will make the war escalate. While the Ukrainians were saying it was all arbitrary and silly, and it was just the Americans not really understanding the Kremlin's mentality. But this all played out, if you will, from the middle of 2023 through the course of 2024. And over that different time frame when there was a lot of debating going on between Kiev and Washington about what weapons it was quote unquote safe or unsafe to give the Ukrainians to hit targets in Russia. The Ukrainians developed their own weapons, and it's like starting with drones. And so now the Ukrainians are hitting targets inside of Russia with their drones at ranges like they hit an ammunition base earlier this week, about 1,700 kilometers inside of Russia, which is a very big distance, and it's a huge distance for a country that's at war being attacked by Russia because they did not have this capacity at the beginning of the war. They developed it. And what the weapons that they used are a long-range drone that runs on that communicates with Starlink and uses open source targeting. As I understand it, that is from open source satellites. And what's happened is that the Ukrainians have developed their own long-range strike capacity. They've gone from zero to they're now slugging it out, and they're trading blows almost on an equal basis with the Russians. And the Americans tried to convince both sides to stop making long-range strikes at one another at the start of March, and they had limited success with that. However, the Ukrainians agreed to a term which effectively prevented both sides from attacking oil and gas and energy infrastructure. There were violations by both sides very quickly after that. However, what that term the part of that term to which the Ukrainians did abide was no long-range strikes against Russian oil and gas infrastructure. And the point behind that is that up until that ceasefire and that narrow term, the Ukrainians had probably by drone strikes undermined and reduced and also destroyed something in between 10 and 20% of all of Russia's oil and gas production capacity. They have been hitting, yes, they have been hitting, they have been hitting oil refineries and pumping stations and storage tanks all over Russia, all over West Russia. They don't really have the ability to reach into.
Just out of interest, how far is Moscow from Ukraine?
That's a good question. Sort of on the order of 750 kilometers, depending on where you measure it. So Moscow is well within range. They have hit targets near Moscow. They've actually flown a few strikes into Moscow, but the air defense network around Moscow is quite dense, and the Ukrainians do not have unlimited numbers of long-range drones. So the general understanding is that the Ukrainians prefer to attack more hittable targets, which they have been doing.
We haven't heard a lot about Crimea from a military standpoint. We've heard a lot about it from a, Trump supposedly saying that he's willing to say that Crimea is Russian, but we haven't heard it from a military standpoint. We did hear about, naval drones attacking this long bridge that comes to Crimea from Russia. What's happening militarily in Crimea, if anything?
Well, I get the starting point for a discussion on Crimea is that the Russians, prior to the war, saw Crimea as their major naval base, not just in the Black Sea, but in the Mediterranean. That was the place from which Russia would project its naval power if it wasn't coming from the Arctic or if it wasn't coming from the Pacific coast. That was it. And the main base from which that all was going to come was a city called Sevastopol. And by October 2023, using a combination of drones and British and French cruise missiles, anti-ship missiles as well, the Ukrainians had forced the Russians to abandon Crimea. They had forced the Russian fleet to abandon Crimea, and by and large, it's still gone. They've sunk about 1 out of every 3 ships in the Russia's Black Sea fleet. If you go by tonnage, every second ton of warship that the Russians had available in the Black Sea at the start of the war is now at the bottom of the Black Sea. That's how effective the Ukrainian bombardment has been. Right now, what's remaining of the Russian Black Sea fleet is based on the Russian Black Sea coast, sort of by Sochi and Novorossiysk and places like that. So, from a naval point of view, Crimea is only useful to Russia if there is no war. Because if there's a war, it's not, do the Ukrainians have the capacity to prevent Crimea from being a usable naval base for the Russians? They've done it. It's an accomplished fact. The Russians likewise have, at the start of the war, used Crimea as a major air base, and they still have, if I remember correctly, three major airfields and I think two or three more not so big airfields, but major military airfields from which they conducted strikes regularly against the Ukrainians. The strikes coming off of those airfields are drastically reduced because, again, they are well within the range of Ukrainian long-range weapons. They're still in use, some of them, but not nearly as intensively. So when the Russians talk about the need for Crimea, it's a peacetime need. In war, it's a difficult place that they are taking losses to maintain.
What's happened to this
Um,
bridge? Is it still? Is it
it's still
still?
there, and the Ukrainians attacked it effectively in 2022. And if you talk to their special operations guys who would be responsible for that attack, they say we believe that we have the capacity probably to take it down right now. It's a question of how many French or German or British cruise missiles that we would need to actually take down a span of the bridge. It would be how much anti-radar missiles that we would need in order to suppress the air defense radars around the bridge so that the strike could go in. So it would be a complex operation. It would not be something that you could sort of plan on the back of a matchbook cover and do it in 12 hours. It would be very complicated. But they've said over and over that they believe that they have the capacity to do it right now. And the question is to the Ukrainian public sometimes, well, why aren't you knocking it down? Because everybody can understand that that bridge is a key logistical link for the Russians to Crimea. And the answers that you get as well, it's like a lot of resources, and we have other things we need to shoot missiles at, and the Russians have other ways to supply their troops, which is true, besides through Crimea. So it's not as critical a logistical route as it used to be, which may be so, or maybe it's that the Ukrainians really don't think that they have the wherewithal to reliably take the bridge down. But if you talk to them officially, that's sort of anytime we want, we can take it down. That's what we're saying. That's what they're saying.
And the balance of the front on the in the east is pretty stagnant.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Over the last, let's say, 2 months, it's very difficult to say that net either side is making progress. Probably the Russians have a slight edge, but it's very, very small. There are gains the size of a football field at the price of hundreds of men in the course of a week. And but the Ukrainians are making counterattacks again, not across the front, but very, very narrow sectors. But they've regained ground in several places. So overall, it's fighting. People are absolutely dying. It's a real war.
It sounds sort of like World War One and just stagnant front lines.
It is. The Ukrainians have have a term for it. They call it the drone barrier, and the idea is that the drones are so powerful and omnipresent that pretty much any attack that attempts to get close to an opposing defensive line is going to get so cut to pieces by drones that neither side can attack. Um, there are military people on both sides who say, yeah, well, true, but number one, during World War One in the East, there was a war of maneuver and concentrations of troops and giant movements over very short periods of time because troop densities weren't like on the Western Front during World War One. And the other thing they'll say is, yeah, well, but World War One ended. and it ended in a war of movement because one side could not sustain the attrition. And the moment that happened, things started collapsing, falling down like dominoes. So if you talk to the military people here, it's never, this is an endless war where, okay, I'm going to not really talk about the Russians because that's really, I'm not really qualified to do that. But from the Ukrainian military point of view, you never hear, oh, this is just pointless. We're in a World War One scenario where there's this meat grinder going on. It's rather, we just need to keep it up and we need to keep killing these Russians because sooner or later, no army can sustain unlimited casualties forever. And
One would like to believe that's true. I hope it's true.
I have struggled with trying to understand whether or not that's soldiers talking to a foreign reporter, and like pitching things. But I mean, honestly, it really does seem like that's the mindset. The Ukrainians have really gone way past this kind of, oh my God, how will we deal with this giant opponent? They're not intimidated by the Russians anymore. That's long gone. So a good example of how looks is that if you ask who has the best morale of any of the Ukrainian units, the types of units, I don't know, the infantry, the artillery, the Air Force guys, whoever, without question. And I am a source on this. It's the drone guys. And these are like, they're sometimes, like car mechanics. Sometimes they're, classic internet geek guys. Sometimes they're older fellows who you would never think you'd see, operating a joystick on a drone. But they just, they seem to get up in the morning and they just are just happy to go fly aircraft and go blow up things. So they see it on the screen. And, there's a whole another discussion about how normal these people are going to be once the war ends and they have to go back into civilian society, because you're talking about people. I mean, I've talked to them that they're like normal guys, but I mean, they are responsible personally for not only killing or wounding thousands, seriously, thousands of enemy human beings, but they watched it on a video. I mean, they didn't stop. It's like, how does this person reintegrate with society? Well, the Ukrainians aren't thinking about that yet. It's a question. But I mean, the morale of these guys is like, they just think it's great. They think that they're having a wonderful time.
Stefan Korshak from the Kyiv Post. Thank you very much for joining us and giving us a sense of what's going on in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war that's going on. I hope you're right that eventually attrition causes people to stop and think and change things. If people want to follow you and progress in your writing, how's the best way to do that? Social media or what?
I must say that I strongly recommend you read Kyiv Post newspaper because it gives pretty good coverage. We like to think of what's going on in Ukraine. It comes out all daily. It's updated regularly, and you want more detail than your average North American source of information about Ukraine. We're there. Please give it a click. As to me personally, my name is Stefan Korshak. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Substack. You can find me on Medium. And, I generally respond to messages to the writers. So, glad to talk to you.
Really appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much. And everyone, you've got 3 hours left on election day. We haven't talked politics in Canada today, but we're going to talk about it a lot starting around 9:30 tonight. We're going to go actually from 9 o'clock until we get the results, which will probably be, I think, around 10:30 or so. And so please join back in on 9:60 a.m. starting at around 9 o'clock tonight. You've got 3 hours left to vote. This is our franchise. This is what people in Ukraine are fighting for, is the right for democracy, the right to vote. So let's get out and exercise our electoral franchise. Thank you very much. That's our show for tonight, everybody. See you in a few hours at 9 p.m. tonight for Election Night Special. Good night, everybody. Stefan, thank you very much. I really appreciate chatting with you.